You just made a comment. You said that you don't think the constitutional rights apply to corporations, and would you extend that to media corporations? You know, New York Times is a corporation, Washington Post is a corporation, NBC is a corporation, National Public Radio is a corporation. And you're trying to carve out an exception in your proposed amendment that says this doesn't apply to the press. Well, I don't see how you're going to do that. And so I can't see how you can make this artificial distinction and give some rights to some corporations that Congress feels it deserves and take it away from others.
Thank you. It's a great question. And it's another one of those questions that raises one of the tough issues. Fortunately, I believe the issue was answered it was answered in 1787 and after, where our First Amendment made that distinction. We don't create an exception for the press. The founders did. And the First Amendment says that Congress shall not pass any law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So we wanted to make clear in our amendment, we're restoring the First Amendment to those words: freedom of speech, it's people who speak, and freedom of the press. And it may be corporations who are press, and we're not trying to meddle with that. So that's why our amendment says, and don't misunderstand this, we're not touching the clause of the First Amendment that says freedom of the press. So that's part of the answer. And I know that doesn't answer all the questions, because that leaves a whole can of worms about, well, what's press? And that gets harder all the time to say what's press. When we had 3 newspapers and 4 TV channels, it was easy. But now it's getting harder and harder to say what's press. But I don't think that because a question is hard, we don't know that AIG is not press. You know, that we don't know that Goldman Sachs is not press. We can decide, the Supreme Court can decide cases, and if our amendment prevails, as we trust it will be back to where we were for the first 200 and something years, where the Supreme Court had to figure out whether there's a freedom of press issue or a freedom of speech issue.
It seems useful to define the corporations are not people, but doesn't it still remain to define what rights corporations do have and what rights corporations don't have? Isn't that question still open?
That's a very good question, and it is, at least it was open until Citizens United, because my answer to that is, that's what we do as people. You know, we, in our legislators across the states, define what rights. If you want to get a corporate charter, you get a list. Here's the rights that come with it. You don't like, and the duties. It's not just rights, it's duties. You got to file your annual report. You've got to do a lot of stuff if you want to be a corporation and organize yourselves into a corporate form. But you get a list of rights and a list of duties. And that has always been defined by the people through their states. What's changed now is Citizens United saying, no, you can't do that anymore. We're telling you, you can't define one of the duties to stay out of politics. That now violates the First Amendment. So I think it's a very good question, and the answer is we the people define the rights and duties. And if you're trying to start a business and you don't like the sort of rules of the game that come with a corporation, nobody has to use it. You can be a partnership, you can be a sole proprietorship, there's different ways, but I think most states want it to be effective economic organizing entities, to be able to form corporations and have them have rights to go into court and sue, to be sued, to sign, the president can sign for the corporation and that will bind the corporation when there's another president. So all of those things that make corporations persons under state law, those are good things. But what we shouldn't do is get confused that makes them persons under the Constitution, 2 different things. So.
Unions are made up of individuals, and you consider them like a corporation. They spend money on campaigns.
They do, and McCain-Feingold actually prohibited union expenditures the same way it prohibited corporation expenditures. I think the answer really, it's a lawyer answer, it depends. What I'd say it depends on is whether the union is a corporation. If the union decides to incorporate, then in my view, it should live with the rules that we give to corporations. That doesn't mean that workers can't unite into unions and do what they want to do. this is not about associations of people. And that's the thing I think Justice Kennedy got really wrong. He said corporations are associations of people, like other associations, and we can't limit the rights of associations of people. But I'm not exaggerating. Law School 101, corporations are not associations of people. I mean, if I wrote that on my corporations class law exam, I would not get that answer right. I mean, as a matter of law, it's a fundamental mistake to say they're associations of people. Now, is it a mistake to say unions are associations of people? I would say no. You have to ask the next question. Well, is it a corporation or not? And the difference is, if you need this sort of state structure that comes with the deal, essentially, of what a corporation is, then you live with the rights and duties and obligations that come with that. If it's a group of people getting together, you have all the rights of people. And that's what a group of people has rights too. And we don't want to be confused. We don't want to be misunderstood to be saying a corporation group is a we're going to push those guys out of the Constitution. That's a bad group. It's not what this is about. Groups of people have rights. A corporation is not a group of people. It's a statutory entity that has engines of policy in effect that make it different. So, is that helpful? Is that the? Yeah.
Conservatives in general have been extremely critical of what they call judicial activism. It seems to me that this is a radical act of judicial activism and overreach.
I fully agree that this is a radical act, and in fact, Justice Stevens said it was a radical departure from settled First Amendment law. We can't go into the minds of the justices, obviously, and we don't have the ability to go and interview them. But what I will say is that the history of how this case reached this point is one that's deeply troubling. And Jeff highlighted that in his remarks. This was not a case that even the plaintiffs who brought it had sought. The plaintiffs who brought this case were seeking to overturn a provision that became Feingold law dealing with that 60-day ban on corporate advertising for elections. They were not seeking to overturn Austin v. Michigan Chamber of Commerce. It was not part of the factual record at the trial court level. And yet this court chose, rather than ruling on the narrow questions before it, chose to hold the case over until September of 2009, prior to the start of the new term. As many remember, Sonia Sotomayor was confirmed in an expedited way because there was this case that was pending that needed to be heard in September before the court was to sit. And the briefing was rushed. I mean, Jeff was away, and like many others engaged in briefing this, had to rush through the process to get the briefs filed in July. So it is deeply troubling what they were engaged in when, in fact, the case never originated like that. They brought up themselves on their own invention the questions of whether or not they should overturn this long-standing precedent. I do believe that it will go down in history like Bush v. Gore, like other egregious rulings in our nation's history. Reverend Yearwood of the Hip Hop Caucus has referenced it as the Dred Scott of our time. Dred Scott, as we know, is that Supreme Court ruling that sanctioned slavery in the United States. And just as much as African Americans are not 3/5 human, nor are corporations people, and this will, I think, be seen along the lines of those kinds of egregious decisions. And it was commented to me just the other day that the court, according to some observers, is quite stunned by the anger that its ruling has demonstrated. If that's true, it demonstrates that we're doing a good job already. In the 2 months, and I don't mean just we, free speech for people, but all of us collectively as a citizenry speaking out on this, and all the news that's already been out there on this, and the polling and so forth, to demonstrate that the shock that the justices, at least some of those 5 perhaps had when President Obama spoke at the State of the Union demonstrates perhaps the kind of bubble they're living in, that they had no clue, really, the impact of what how the people would respond. I think they knew what they were doing. I don't think perhaps they recognized the kind of response the people would give, and I think this constitutional amendment campaign will further demonstrate that we as a people will ultimately have the last word.
This land is your land, this land is my land, California, New York Island, the Redwood Forest, and the Gulf Stream waters.